crazy change in the last 3 months. Like every 24 hours feels like it's a new thing.
Yeah. And it's, it looks very good to me. It's really hard to judge a game in the middle of the first quarter.
Yeah.
And he's scored a few amazing goals.
Yeah. I do think it almost feels like, because I know for today's discussion we have Burgum on the agenda, but I do feel like so many of these things are interconnected, because these are like gigantic moves that are being made to position the United States for the next 20 or 30 years to be the leader in progress in everything. I mean, that's what I'm getting out of this whole thing.
What was that book? A Team of Enemies, a Team of Rivals? Doris Kearns Goodwin on Lincoln's cabinet. She wrote a book called A Team of Rivals, because every member of Lincoln's cabinet was kind of a rival of another member of the cabinet. And so everybody thought it was going to be a disaster. It turned out to be an incredible team that worked so well together. I'm not sure this is a team of rivals, but if you think about it, almost every member of this team came from a different party from the party they're now serving.
Yeah.
Or a very large number of them did. I mean, I think that when the history books are written, if things continue this way, of course, we're in very early in the first innings. But if things continue this way, this is going to be one for the history books. It's already one for the history books in the first 3 months.
A very naive sort of take on this, because it's funny because we're both investors, and you've been in the game just a little bit longer than I have, Larry, like maybe a couple of years.
Yes.
Okay. But I do feel like, and I'm curious to get your take on this, cultural sentiment and just like the vibe, the energy in the air, like the things that you take in feel like the underlying foundational forcing function for these opportunities to actually thrive. And it feels like right now we're in that kind of time.
I know where you're going and I know what you're saying, but I would be a little bit more cautious, because we are living in a bubble. And I've just been listening to RFK giving evidence to Congress, the House of Congress, and I have to say, I mean, the being spewed at him by the Democrats, I don't think they share the vibe with you. I really don't think they share the vibe with you. But I want to go back to this cabinet, because the subject of today's meeting is Burgum, Doug Burgum.
Yes.
Who is the Secretary of Commerce, our newly appointed Secretary of Commerce. And, I want to, just to set the stage, I should hate Doug Burgum. I mean, he kind of ended but had a company in the late 90s that sold enterprise software to mid to smaller companies. Kind of, we were the SAP for the small guys, and we were very successful. We were kind of just hitting our stride, and we kept bumping up against this little software company, that was already growing very rapidly, software company out of all places, Dakota. Now, can you imagine forming a software company in South Dakota?
Nope.
And, we didn't take it serious until Microsoft turned around and bought the bloody thing. Now, if you think Microsoft is a behemoth today, man, it bestrode that narrow world like a colossus, to quote Shakespeare, in those days, because it was the Microsoft, the Google, the Facebook combined.
That's when they got in trouble with the antitrust stuff back in the day?
Yeah. I mean, it was at the very height of their power, and they bought Great Plains. They didn't call me. They called Doug Burgum of Great Plains. And the thing was, we were facing this massive, massive capital investment. Why? Because just as AI is disrupting everything today, Microsoft Windows was disrupting. Well, it was really Apple that had caused the disruption, but Microsoft Windows was converting to Windows. And to cut a long story short, it would have required enormous investment to convert our software into a Windows product. And Doug Burgum's acquisition by Microsoft was for them to do that very thing with his company. Well, they killed us. I mean, they killed us. And Doug Burgum, he went on over to Microsoft and he ran that operation, and he built an empire for Microsoft in the small to medium-sized business. So, yeah, I should definitely hate Doug Burgum. As it turned out quite well, because this has all happened in 1999 with the dot-com bubble just and growing, and I thought, we've got to get out. And so I sold the company in mid-1999, which,
perfect timing.
And it was forced by Doug Burgum. So,
you should be thanking him.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, that's not the point of today's story. The point of today's story is that Doug Burgum is an extraordinary visionary, manager, and operator. And really, I have enormous respect for him. And here he is, the Department of Interior. When you think about, leaders of the Department of Interior, you just think of the bureaucratic crud that they layer, one layer upon another layer upon another layer. And as we're going to learn, it actually matters. It matters a huge amount, because the Department of Interior could unleash enormous wealth for the country. Yeah. And of course, secretaries of the Interior up to now have been completely without any imagination or sense or, any sort of founder would bring. And boy, Doug Burgum is one hell of a founder. Anyway.
Yeah, no, and I love the way you've sort of framed that story. So a lot of this is this discussion was born out of all of us watched the interview that he had with David Friedberg from All In. They had one of these like All In podcast series where Friedberg sitting down with all these and like the guys doesn't have to be Friedberg, but all the other guys are sitting down, and they had a fantastic episode. I believe it was last week or the week before,
2 weeks ago,
where Doug talked about sort of what he's learned so far and what are the things that he can do to sort of unleash America's true potential so that we can all win together and thrive together and really highlight those things. So, and I know Larry was really captivated by that story, so we're going to sit down and sort of learn through that. As Larry's somebody who, again, is familiar with Doug and somebody that understands this deeply. You had some pretty key takeaways. So where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with where the interview took place. It was just, it was just Doug Burgum and I guess it was David Friedberg.
Yeah.
And, there was just the two of them. But in the background was this giant gas tanker, this tanker that freezes the gas, that takes, freezes the gas and ships it across the sea. And what's important about it is that this port that is shipping LNG across the world is the second largest LNG port in the world, second only to the one, I think, in Kuwait or Qatar, I'm not sure, Qatar actually. And, 5 years ago, that port was an importer of LNG, and today it's become the second largest exporter of LNG in the world. And that's the story that that Doug was framing. 3 years we've gone from energy poor to energy rich, and that happened, in Trump's first term, and it's been somewhat dialed back under the last president, but they're opening the spigots now. And what's important about that is the massive income it brings into the United States. And what's even more important about it is that when we mine for LNG, when we mine for oil, where we recover oil and liquid natural gas or gas from our sources, we do it far more cleanly than the rest of the world. So for every amount of gas or oil that we deliver to the world, we improve by and large the ecology. But that's not it. That's not the essence of what Doug Burgum is talking about. He's talking about dollars in versus dollars out. And this is bringing dollars in so many ways. Firstly, it brings, export earnings. Secondly, it reduces our imports. And thirdly, it places us in a very important strategic position. We're not, beholden to anybody for our energy, and others become beholden to us. So, just that part of the conversation is very important to understand, but it's not the whole part. It's not a scintilla of what really he's about, because he's about so much more than that and so much more meaningful stuff than that. But LNG itself is a game changer. What he's about is energy dominance. Because as important as LNG is, oil is still critical to our economy and will be for the next 30 years to come. And so that's why he's very focused on that, and he's very realistic about that, and that's very important. China has very little oil. It's importing a huge amount of oil.
Do we know from who? Who are the primary?
Well, right now from Russia in a very big way.
Right. And
from the Middle East. I mean, China buys from wherever they can get the oil, really. And that's why they're building nuclear power stations at scale. And that's why they're building solar energy, solutions at scale, far greater than the United States by orders of magnitude. And Doug Burgum focuses on how we have allowed the nuclear energy sector to atrophy and how we have to refocus, particularly on small SMRs, these small modular reactors that are both much safer, but much quicker and less expensive to build, we think and we believe. But China is running away with the SMR technology. Doug Burgum wants to reinstate nuclear, wants to get SMRs up. And that brings us to the next leg of what Doug is really focused on, and that is regulation. What's killing us more than anything, and where China is showing, us how to overcome the problem, is regulation and bureaucracy. He talks about if you need a pipeline in this country, a gas pipeline in this country, which is critical for industrial production, if you touch in any state you pass through, federal lands, you're kind of dead. They can stop you. I mean, the state can stop you. The local people can stop you. It becomes an impossible task. And we've seen pipelines, in the last administration, we saw those cut. Well, if you want your economy to grow, and if you want us to become an industrial exporter, if you want to solve our balance of payments, if you want to solve our tax problem, if you want to solve our deficit problem, you've got to manufacture in this country. How do you manufacture when you can't have energy?
And it's so funny that you bring this up too, because this whole conversation, when we saw the interview come through and we learned more about Burgum and sort of his approach to how to build this, at the same exact time, a few days ago, we saw that post from Elon Musk saying that I'm thinking about how to equal America's output of energy, right? So that I can get compute. And then my head immediately went to, oh, okay. So these things are tied. This is an all-together thing. It's
absolutely
all
tied to each other. When you look at the massive changes that this administration is wreaking, the focus is on making industrial again. And, I've heard even, great industrial economists like Niall Ferguson, who I admire immensely, and is, of course, has much greater stature and is much brighter than I am, talk about we'll never be industrial again because nobody wants to work in these dirty, conditions and get all greased up. He has no clue of what manufacturing is about anymore. I mean, if you see the videos of, say, the battery plant, the Megapack factory, there was a release today by the Silicon Valley, one of the Tesla clubs toured the Megapack factory today. There's nobody walking around with grease on their hands there. Right. I mean, that's modern manufacturing. When you see the video of the SpaceX satellite factory building Starlinks, you see young girls walking around in miniskirts. I mean, there's no industrial, crud in manufacturing. But we're not manufacturing. Why? For all the reasons of regulation, bureaucracy, not in my backyard. And on top of it, on top of anything, everything is energy. So you're right. I was talking about a terawatt of energy for AI. And he'll get there. I mean, this is his new focus. And it's going to change everything. In fact, all the numbers that everybody's been running up to now on Tesla and on XAI, you're going to have to throw out of the window.
Yeah, because it's going to go crazy. I think one of the things that we learned We sat down with Jordan Gissinger from the Limiting Factor on Monday, and we had a discussion. We're going to release a podcast on this probably tomorrow. But one of the things that really came to the surface level for like these projects to actually occur, where we can unleash America's energy, we're going to have to not only bypass a regulatory environment that's already difficult to navigate. So we need deregulation, but we also need a massive modernization of our grid to if we want to utilize the grid. But then if we don't want to utilize the grid, there's also methods to do this behind the meter, like that, where you are not plugged into the grid. Exactly. Things like SMRs.
Well, you need these small nuclear reactors, you need batteries, you need all the above, but you definitely need to improve the grid. That isn't the easiest way forward, but there are modern means of using the existing grid and changing the current, steel, low-grade steel cables that they're using right now for a much higher grade cable carry much, much, much more energy.
Yeah,
there are many ways. But look, Burgum is leading a council called the National Energy Dominance Council. That is what they say. Dominance. Nice. Now, you want to put a terawatt into AI. That's dominance. Yeah. I'm not sure that it's possible to do that all in the United States. I know Elon has his heart set on that. Maybe you have to actually spread it across 2 or 3 countries. If Burgum is going to achieve national energy dominance, he's going to need everything. He's going to need pipelines. He's going to need natural gas. He's going to need a new grid, or let's say a re-engineered grid. He's going to need small nuclear reactors. He's going to need large nuclear reactors. He's going to have to return some of these nuclear reactors that have been, made dormant. They're going to return. And he's going to have to drill for oil, and he's going to have to drill for gas, and he's going to have to use coal. All the above. Yeah.
Because otherwise you don't get there. Right? Yeah. Otherwise you don't get there. You have to utilize everything you have within your borders. Now, I can already hear like part of the audience is going to be like, why are we ramping up oil and natural gas efforts? Why are we doing all this? Isn't this sort of like a pigeonhole? Isn't this like anti-climate? Blah, blah, blah. But then at the beginning of not blah, blah, blah. I think those are legitimate actual things that people are coming up with. Yeah, they are very legitimate. But I think the interesting thing to think through, which is sort of what you said at the beginning, was that if we do it versus China doing it, or let's say countries in Africa doing it, or other countries, they're going to approach it in a very different way than we are. And if we don't take on some sort of energy dominance approach where we're trying to really ramp up our energy, all that means is that we're going to fall behind because everyone else is going to do it. Right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And there are other problems. There are legitimate political problems. Look at this map. This is a map of the United States and Alaska and Hawaii. You see these red blocks? Do you know what they are?
Where we have oil and natural gas available to us to drill?
They're areas of our coastline that we could drill on, but they're in red because of one reason and one reason only. Because the Biden administration, in the closing hours of Biden's presidency, issued a presidential order, an executive order, with apparently his signature on it, but we know it was made by machine.
AutoPen.
Yes. But anyway, the point is, he issued an edict, which are the only areas we have to drill, to deep sea drilling.
So why would he do that?
Pardon?
Why would he do that?
So that Trump wouldn't drill. Obama had closed the areas for 5 years. Those 5 years would be coming up. And there's no doubt this administration would have reached out and given leases on these on these areas. And you know what? By closing these areas, by proclaiming these areas closed, they cannot be opened again without an act of Congress.
Wow. So it's kind of like he is okay. So is it just a purposeful hamstringing of Trump's ability to grow the economy so that they can get back into office in 2028 and being like, look at how slow your economy was. You weren't able to generate energy, blah, blah, blah. Or is there actually some legitimate motives behind it that says, oh, we're trying to protect the climate. We're trying to protect the ocean. Like, I'm trying to figure out like, why would you limit America's ability to actually try to capitalize on the artificial intelligence boom and set ourselves up in a winning position versus our relative competitors I'm trying to understand the logic behind this. Like why Biden would do
there's
something
a
like
very
this.
deep-set belief by the progressive left in climate change, and I have to agree that we do face a very serious problem with climate change, and so that's translated into oil equal bad and stop oil.
Yeah.
What that does is translate into the worst possible recovery of oil globally in terms of climate damage.
Yeah.
So it's like you're looking for the worst outcome. You're going to shut the US off from the revolution, AI revolution, and the industrial and the third great industrial revolution, and you're going to make the ecology worse because
no one else cares about it as much as you do.
Everybody else is oil with much greater ecological damage than we do. So it couldn't have been worse. Couldn't have been calculated as worse.
Yeah.
So, there are these very serious impediments that you have these local political movements against any form of fracking, any form of oil drilling, any form of, Alaska was closed off under previous governments. This president is opening up Alaska again. And so it's critical from, every perspective in terms of energy to change those policies. And so thank goodness we have a guy like Doug Burgum who has this sense of balance. So look, South Dakota, he was governor of South Dakota after he left Microsoft. He did a marvelous job of uplifting South Dakota into, top from the bottom to the top in terms of economic well-being. Now, there's another area that we have to talk about in terms of what he's involved in. He's the Secretary of the Department of Interior. We talk about our critical deficit, and the deficit is going to really be something our children are going to be struggling with. Your generation is going to be struggling with. I've enjoyed, the great wealth of the 80s and the 90s, even the 60s, but you guys are going to have to struggle with it, and your children are going to really struggle with it. And Doug Burgum's point is this country doesn't have to struggle with economic deficit. We have the means to turn our deficit into massive surpluses. We're incredibly rich. We're focused right now on our earnings, the earnings part of our balance sheet, as it were, because we're focused on our deficit versus, some sort of surplus. And so we're going to have to tax ourselves into poverty just to survive, or our dollar is going to go for a burden, and then the whole economy is going to fall apart. But Doug Burgum is saying, listen, the United States balance sheet is the strongest balance sheet in the world. We have these gigantic assets that belong to the federal government, and we don't have to give them away, but we can turn them into massive, massive earnings. I want to show you something, and just to prove his point, not my point, but this is his point. I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you an incredible depiction. You see those red blotches all across the West and all across the United States of America and throughout.
I do. I'm very familiar with this map, actually. Yeah.
You know what those red blotches are?
Federal land. That's
the land the federal government owns. They either own title to it or they own the rights to it, but the federal government's assets. Do you know what those assets are worth?
Trillions of dollars.
And you don't have to sell them to make that money. What's underlying those red dots and what's on top of those red dots or red blotches there's minerals of untold wealth. There's forests of enormous value, and there's grazing to be done. There's almost no end to the opportunity on those great lands.
So, but is there a way to do this the right way, right? Because I think this is the one that. So, for example, I've traveled to Colorado multiple times. I've traveled to California. I've traveled to parts of Nevada. Like these are beautiful. These are the most beautiful parts in the world, in my opinion. I mean, it's just absolutely shocking, stunning scenery that we get from these lands. And so, does that automatically mean that we're going to ruin what the United States is known for, which is just beautiful, vast landscape? Or we've said we do it better than everybody else from an ecological perspective. But does this still mean that we're going to end up regretting doing this because we're going to ruin the natural beauty that the United States has, plus the untold consequences potentially from, runoff and doing it incorrectly, and you end up getting, the fracking ends up in the water, et cetera, et cetera. So like, how do we balance those two things?
Well, of course, I mean, we have a terrible history in the country of ruining the land by the mining we do and by the putting industrial sites and destroying those industrial sites. But, one learns, and we've learned the very hard way, the right way to do things, and that there's a right way and a wrong way. And what we've done is we've gone far, far, far beyond what we should be doing. And so there's a middle ground. There is a way to exploit the land and not destroy the land. And, the lesson is Germany. Germany was one of the richest countries in the world and the richest country in Europe. And they decided to stop mining coal and to close down their nuclear reactors. Germany slipped to, I think, the third or the fourth wealthiest country. And believe me, when you get down to that level in Europe, you're not doing that well. And it has if it continues the current policies, it has no way to go other than to slip down to 10, because they have to somehow sustain this massive social welfare structure they've built. Plus, they brought 1 million immigrants into the country. Now they have to support, train, and bring, to the level of the rest of the country. So the answer is you can do both. You can mine, for example, look at the forests. We import, the biggest import we do from Canada, which is gigantic, is lumber. Why would we import lumber when we've got millions of acres of forest? Oh, you say don't destroy the forest. But you know what? By not actually managing the forests, they're burning down anyway. So the point is, there are absolutely the right way to do things and the wrong way. And when we're talking about mining, it is such a tiny proportion of the land we're talking about actually touching that you would never see it in your trips to the West.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and this is where this is where the balancing act is so, has been difficult to talk about for the last 10, 20 years.
Not allowed to talk about it.
We're not allowed to talk about it. And so because we're not allowed to talk about it, we've ceded our national security to other countries. I mean, that's really it. We are now dependent on our competitors and our adversaries and countries that potentially could be long-term, it could be an issue, like a big issue. We've just allowed them to take leadership positions that we're dependent on. And when it comes to national security, right? And when it comes to national security, it's like, okay, do we prioritize nature at all costs so that we don't damage anything at all and we introduce zero risk of potential damage? Or do we just let somebody else roll in and claim us? And then our entire world switches to how they want to run things versus how we want to run things. That's the reality of the situation. It's like, unless all 8 billion people on the planet all agree that we should not exploit the land under any circumstance, then I agree. But that's never going to happen. And so at that point, right, it's like...
The Earth would never sustain 8 billion people.
Right. Unless we exploit something.
Look, the Earth could 20 billion people. But you would have to have a very different approach to, ecology and maintaining the ecological balance than you currently have, which is just nuts. It's like, stop everything. It's nuts. Look, Burgum's vision is really bold. It's make America the world's energy leader, power AI and manufacturing, secure our allies, and pay down our debt with our own resources. You say this comes at a cost, but it's a cost that not only can be well balanced, but can actually have huge benefits from an ecological point of view. So, we're stuck in the 1980s, and this administration, and Burgum in particular, is trying to uplift us into, modernity. And the thing about it is, if we don't do it, China's going to do it. And they're not going to do it with the respect that we have for the land. So, yeah, you say, well, they'll only destroy their own land and their own people. No, we all will pay the price, all of us, including the Americans.
And that's again that's the true complexity of the situation. And I think what impresses me about Burgum is like sort of his pragmatic approach to this. I think I definitely do have concerns about the exploitation and taking it too far. Human greed has taken us to really bad places before. I mean, just look at the pharmaceutical industry.
It's not against.
We have a whole separate discussion for that later this week. But that's one of my concerns. I do think this is one of the main reasons why I'm glad someone like Elon Musk is part of the administration, because he can. I do think he's a champion for climate, and I do think he's a champion for moving us to a sustainable future. And I think what people need to realize that might be doubtful about this is that sustainability is possible. Is 1,000% possible. But that also means that we have to make some tough decisions about okay, how much of the land that we have actually do we decide to exploit to become sustainable? It's like if you want to live the life that you want to live, you can't live that life without energy. You just can't. And if you want a better future for yourself and your children and your great-grandchildren and so on and so forth, that energy is going to have to exist. And in more plentiful amounts, especially as your adversaries in the rest of the world go ever quicker towards their version of a better future. And so for us to say, no, we're not going to take part of that better future because we are concerned about what we might do to the land, I 1,000% agree we should be concerned, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't go as fast as we can while giving respect to the land to ensure that we don't lose that. Because once we lose that, we lose everything.
Look, there's a link between energy and prosperity.
Yeah.
And never has that link been more apparent or stronger. Every major leap in human progress, industrial revolution, tech boom, came with more energy. In 2024, energy access lifted 50 million people out of poverty globally, according to the World Bank. Burgum's not saying ignore the environment. He's saying we can do both smarter. Inner production, sustainable leasing, and innovation.
Yeah.
We have to get behind this. This is an historic moment. And by the way, on the way to this energy independence and this energy prosperity, as we get there, we solve the problem of the deficit.
Yeah.
I mean, what could be better?
Famous last words. No, I'm kidding. I think the potential is obvious. And I think the forcing functions are too strong. The forcing functions are too strong. We're going to get on this regardless. The key thing we have to make sure we do is that we hold our public folks, the people that are in government in positions of influence. We need to make sure that we hold them accountable if they start going down the wrong path and they start going down the path of pure greed. And then screw everything else. We've seen that before multiple times. We have to be very careful. We understand that better now. We have more information available to us about history than ever before. We're more educated than we ever have been. We have the tools to do this correctly. Right. And I think we just have to make sure that we do it correctly, but we go as fast as we can. And we leverage as much ingenuity as we have to make it happen.
And we started this conversation about this administration and this cabinet, and this cabinet being, a team of rivals, let me just say that a team that we just never would have expected this president to have chosen. A team of a team of unexpectables. And I think that it's a team that could well pull this off. So I'm very excited. I didn't realize I'd get this excited about this administration. It's completely against, all that 10 years ago. And now here we are. Anyway.
A lot of hope in the air. A lot of hope in the air. Yeah. Anything else you want to hit, Larry, before we sign off?
I think we're done.
I think we did a good job.
Just, shout out to the guys at All In.
Yeah.
Great. And David Friedberg, great interview.
Yeah, 100%. I think Friedberg's style of interview to me is one of my favorites that they have, because he asks such pointed questions, and then he lets the guest go. Yeah. He just let him go, and then it's like he picks up on the thread that's most important, and then boom, takes it to a different direction. So I think honestly, you should take Jason's chair, and Jason just needs to go. You're
singing my song.
Shout out Jake Al. Love you, brother. All right. Thank you, Larry.
Take care, man.
All right. Bye.